Today we are joined by someone who is not brand new to Ann Arbor, but rather whose work and insights and intellect is well known not just to us, but far more widely through the profession at large, as shown by this good turnout on the first full Wednesday of the term. I'm pleased to welcome Louis Siegelbaum, professor of Russian history at Michigan State University, and friend and colleague, to start the year's events. I should probably avoid most of the cross-campus ribbing, which isn't really necessary. I guess the football season hasn't proceeded far enough into ignominy to require that of us yet. He doesn't need an elaborate introduction in any case for this group, so I'll be brief. Louis Siegelbaum went to Columbia, then earned a DPhil at Oxford and taught in Australia before setting up shop in a small agricultural community to our north. I couldn't help myself. See, I told you. He's been at Michigan State since 1983, where he's built a career of international distinction. I'm very pleased to say that he is a CREASE research associate, and he also participates fully in the life of our campus, too, as a visiting faculty member, as an Eisenberg Institute fellow. I believe that was last year, an interlocutor with our students, and much more. It would really be impossible for me to summarize his work in Soviet history. I'm not about to list all 10 of his books. Don't worry about that. But he's concentrated perhaps especially on questions of material culture, social relations, ideological as well as technological changes and their impacts and intersections. Very versatile work. Each book travels a swath of new terrain, from the politics of Stalin-era productivity to his most recent book, the prize-winning Cars for Comrades, which came out 2 years ago. He's now working on movement and migration in Soviet spaces, and you'll be hearing about his research on the Soviet Sixties, which is a very hot topic in the field these days, I think. I will just single out one last but hugely important, I think, service that he's performed for the wider profession. And I'm mentioning this especially for the students in case they're not aware of it. Along with James von Geldern, Louis has written a really amazing online resource for the teaching of modern Russian and Soviet history. It's called 17 Moments in Soviet History. And if that doesn't ring a bell, I just wanted to put it on your radar screens, and you should take a look at soviethistory.org. A really easy to remember URL. So he clearly got it early in the internet period to have snagged that. Today he'll be talking about one of his many ongoing interests and projects, and the lecture, as you know, is called Modernity, Unbound, Tol'iatti as a Soviet City of the 60s. Louis.
Oh. That's interesting. Oh, thank you. My script. Well, thank you, Doug, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. As I came into the room a few minutes before you did, I realized that I've been here often, sitting where you're sitting and listening to some really great speakers, and I aspire to at least keeping you awake for the next 35, 40 minutes or so. So without further ado, let me begin by referring to and attempting to justify the first word in my title, modernity. Modernity has had to bear a lot of work over the years. I'm using it in two related senses. As it figures in architectural history, something with which I'm only just recently become acquainted, and as it was used for much of the Soviet period within the USSR itself. Someone someday should do a word content analysis of the Soviet press to see whether современный, contemporary, up-to-date, but also modern, and современность, modernity, appeared proportionately more during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s than in decades previous. My hunch is that along with mature socialist, self-definitions of the nature of Soviet society increasingly were expressed in terms of being modern. What, though, did modernity look like? What was its materialization? If, as the British sociologist John Urey has written, the car was the quintessential, here I'm quoting, quintessential manufactured object of 20th century capitalism, unquote, then my candidate for the state socialist Second World equivalent would be the large prefabricated ferro-concrete panels, the characteristic building material of apartments from the late 1950s onward in cities not only in the USSR, but all across state socialist space. Standardized ferro-concrete panels, such as you see here, the Russian word typizatsiya conveys the process of determining the sizes and shapes to be used. These were the demotic mode, the vernacular of Soviet and East European domestic architecture, whether in Bucharest or Bishkek, Timisoara or Tol'iatti. Having mentioned Tol'iatti, I need to explain why I'm focusing on this Middle Volga city. Nowhere else, at least in the USSR, were ferro-concrete apartment buildings used so prominently, and nowhere else was a brand new ferro-concrete city built on such a scale as in Tol'iatti. Tol'iatti, in other words, got closer than any other Soviet city to realizing the aspiration of building a modern, rationalized society with homogenized, standardized social institutions, material cultures, and patterns of daily life. An aspiration brilliantly satirized in a 1975 film by Eldar Ryazanov called Irony of Fate. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Ironia Sudby. It's a wonderful send-up of the sameness of Soviet cities. It is appropriate at this point for me to introduce Val Kivelson, who's just walked in. No, just kidding. A second, the timing was too good to resist. A second related feature of Tol'iatti's cityscape, the mikrorayon, or micro-district. Where are we at? Essentially an autonomous, self-enclosed unit of apartments, stores, schools, playgrounds, and the like, an approach to urban planning that, like ferro-concrete panels, typified the Khrushchev and especially the Brezhnev eras. This is a photograph I took, as you see, just in July, of Tallinn, of a mikrorayon in Tallinn, but of course it could be anywhere within former Soviet space. Not long ago, Stephen Kotkin noted that along with, and I'm quoting, cheap tracksuits worn by seemingly every male in Uzbekistan or Bulgaria, Ukraine or Mongolia, and children's playgrounds erected over the same cracked concrete panel surfaces and with the same twisted metal piping, all made at the same factories to uniform codes, apartment buildings, outside and inside, schools, indeed entire cities, unquote, were sufficiently identical that, quoting again, studying the urban design and construction of tiny Albania can allow one to generalize about more than 1/6 of the Earth's surface, unquote. Well, such was the appeal of the typizatsiya of the mikrorayon that it was, this is only, I would say, a slight exaggeration. I became interested in Tol'iatti a few years ago when doing research for my book on Soviet cars. The third chapter of that book is about the Volga automobile factory, VAZ, and the city built to accommodate its workforce. That workforce numbered in excess of 100,000 by the mid-1970s, a colossal figure, really, even by Soviet standards. What struck me at first as both predictably Soviet and at the same time astonishing was the determination of Soviet authorities to push ahead with the construction of an entirely new town, Aftergrad. I'll go back to, whoops. The Avtozavodsky Rayon. Adjacent to a town that had only existed for less than 10 years, the so-called Central District. Until 1964, I should explain, this formerly new town was called Stavropol. It contained or was adjacent to some large petrochemical plants and about 170,000 people who lived in predominantly 5-story ferro-concrete apartment buildings, as well as some older structures relocated from the city's original site. That site had disappeared under the Zhiguli Reservoir, or C as it's called, after a massive hydroelectric station was built across the Volga in the mid-1950s. The new Stavropol became Tol'iatti in 1964 in honor of the longtime Italian Communist Party leader Palmiro Togliatti, who died while convalescing in Crimea. Contrary to what I initially had believed, the fact that this city bore the name of a prominent Italian had nothing to do with the decision to locate a car factory there, courtesy of Fiat. So it was Fiat that provided the technological wherewithal for the building of this giant factory, a deal which dwarfed any other that the Soviet Union signed with a foreign enterprise throughout the entirety of Soviet history. The building of Avtograd, essentially a newer version of Tol'iatti, was predictably Soviet because, as an official from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development noted after several on-site visits, the USSR outpaced the rest of the world in building new towns. A 1967 retrospective survey of town planning in the USSR cited a figure of 900 or so, founded between 1926 and 1966, of which about a third could truly claim to be Novostroyki, entirely new, built from scratch, rather than as extensions or satellites of pre-existing towns. Of them, several were not just new towns, but ideal communist cities, as described by a group of Moscow architects in a book by that name published in the late 1950s. Also known as model cities, Goroda Etalon, and initially as socialist cities, Sotsgoroda, they included Zaporozhye. Well, you see the scheme here that I've drawn that figuratively connected in a kind of chain these different cities, Zaporozhye, Magnitogorsk, the original Avtograd, which later became a suburb of Nizhny Novgorod, and is where the workers from staffing the Gaz plant lived, Bratsk, Zelenograd, Tol'iatti, and a few years subsequent to Tol'iatti's new version, Naberezhnye Chelny. These once upon a time ideal communist cities were represented, as Tol'iatti would be, both as mechanisms for transforming rural recruits into model urban residents and as outposts of the future communist society. But one might question the extent to which Tol'iatti was a specifically Soviet or communist-inspired city. Its transformational function, for example, echoed that of Brasilia, the subject of a much celebrated book by James Holston called The Modernist City, and the prime example of what James Scott has termed the high modernist city. For Holston, Brasilia's design and construction, I think I might have a, no, not yet, coming up. For Holston, Brasilia's design and construction were intended as a means to create the new age of Brazil by transforming Brazilian society. In Scott's jaundiced view, the city would be used, quote, to transform the people without qualities, without culture, vagabonds, low-class, low-brow people into the proletarian heroes of the new nation. That's actually a quote from the president of Brazil, Kubitschek, at the time of Brasilia's construction. As for living in the new Tol'iatti, prospective residents could look forward to conditions rarely, if anywhere, experienced in the USSR, and this too resembled the conception of Brasilia, quote, as a city of the future, a city of development, that made no reference to the habits, traditions, and practices of Brazil's past or its great cities, or of its great cities. In a Soviet novel published in 1979 and dedicated to the building of the new Tol'iatti, one of the characters emphasized the future city's fulfillment of personal and familial as distinct from collective needs. Doesn't sound very communist to me. He described it as a model city, a term he defined as follows. Very simply, it's a city where people will live comfortably and happily, where there will be no crowding, neither on the streets, nor in apartments, nor in the stores. And it will be beautiful everywhere. It will be a city in which one can go by foot from one end to the other in an hour and do everything a person normally does. Earn a living, pick up the kids from kindergarten, get a ticket to the sports palace or the cinema, have a look at the polyclinic, call on one's mother-in-law, rest in a prophylactorium. I'm just quoting. Make necessary purchases, order a table in a restaurant for Saturday, go on a yacht, swim in a pool, take a new novel off the shelves of the library. This is not some pipe dream, but an ironclad reality of engineering. Or, I would add, at least town planning. So let's look at the plan developed by a team of architects and engineers from the housing and town planning divisions of what was called the Central Scientific Research and Design Institute, under the direction of Boris Rubanenko. This, too, is a narrative of sorts, a narrative less about the heroism of building a city and housing its builders than about the rationality, efficiency, and above all, modernity of the city itself. The plan, accompanied by line drawings and models characteristic of the period in which they were produced, called for a town stretching from east to west in parallel strips or zones, which I'll show in just a moment, beginning at the shoreline of the artificial sea and proceeding through parkland, a residential zone, and an industrial zone containing the Vaz complex. So just for the sake of clarification, for those who can't read this, the black represents existing populated areas. The vertical lines, areas of existing industry, which in this, and that's the sort of petrochemical plants I referred to earlier. This is the projected area of the new Tol'iatti, which is essentially this, and the forested areas surrounding it. Now we get a little closer in with essentially with each of these slides. Populated territory in black, industry here. Now this is the projected new Tol'iatti. So you see everything to the north, as it were, away from the coastline, is where the Vaz plant would be constructed. This is by year, I think beginning with 1968 and going through 1975. So the phases of the construction of the new city. And notice also how we get increasingly, as it were, geometrical. Here are those strips intersected by or divided by these broad boulevards, some as wide as 600 meters. That's over half a kilometer. The residential zone, the parkland, the industrial zone, or rather the parkland, the residential zone, and the industrial zone. These boulevards would carry traffic, mostly buses, to and from the factory entrance efficiently and safely. The entire city would be subdivided into, let me go through these last two. Micro-districts, and configured according to a recursive system of services, differentiated according to frequency of use, and laid out according to a rational geometric pattern. The main construction material, of course, you already know, large panel components. Every feature of this plan, including the building material, but also the recursive principle, the division into micro-districts, the linearity, the grandiosity, all of this reflected trends in Soviet architectural thinking. Not for nothing was Rubenenko's team awarded a national prize for their efforts, and their general scheme made mandatory course material for generations of architecture students in the USSR and the GDR. That I have from a German architectural historian. The praise lavished on Tol'iatti's Avtograd signified to architecture critic Alexander Wysokovsky that it belonged in the premier class of Soviet architecture. It also, I would assert, though, signified something else, that the time of cosmopolitan modernism in Soviet urban architecture had arrived. Like the heroic communist narrative, this could be rendered in diachronic terms as a chain, extending from Moscow's avant-gardist technical studios and the Bauhaus in the 1920s through Le Corbusier's Athens Charter of 1933 and back to Soviet new town planners of the 1960s, with some points of contiguity or sort of mixture going on along the way, including Le Corbusier's manifesto, and the institution that arose out of that, the CIAM, Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, and its application in Brasilia. Now we get Brasilia. Not only Brasilia, as it turns out, but another plan not only inspired by Le Corbusier, but actually planned by him in the 1950s, the Punjabi city of Chandigarh, capital of India's Punjab province. And other, I'll let you read that quote. So take a breath, if it's breathtaking. Didn't take my breath away. And other major Corbusier-influenced new towns of the post-war era. The difference between the narrative of heroic communist construction and this one, though, if we can consider it a narrative, was its explicitly and unapologetically transnational character. How then, given repeated assertions of systemic difference and incompatibility, was such explicit acknowledgement of indebtedness to bourgeois architects and town planners possible? This is something I pondered for quite a while and came across, or rather resuscitated, a distant memory of mine, which had to do with convergence theory. Convergence theory, which emerged among Western social scientists during the 1960s, can, I would suggest, provide some insight. For one of the things that impressed people like Petrim Sorokin, John Kenneth Galbraith, Michigan's own Alfred G. Meyer, and other convergence proponents was the rise of a new technocratic elite and the increased reliance within what they called mature industrial society on pragmatic and scientific methods to solve social issues or tasks. To be sure, Soviet commentators repeatedly rejected the notion of system convergence, although they did concede that technologies and administrative structures were transferable. What I am suggesting is that this concession was not insignificant. Indeed, that is, the relative autonomy of the technical, underpinned much of what was propagated at the time as the scientific technological revolution, quote unquote, a very popular propagandistic a phrase for the incorporation of technology, whether of Western or whatever origin. Just as Vaz's hyperfactory would represent the latest word in integrated production based on the adoption of Fiat auto technology, so Tol'iatti's Aftergrad would exemplify the best principles of urban planning, whatever their inspiration. Ideologists regarded both projects as essentially technical. The emphasis among architects like Rubenenko on geometric abstraction facilitated such an interpretation. It also enabled them to earn the USSR international plaudits, just as other white-collar workers in other fields did, by applying techniques to improve their performance or that of the materials with which they worked. And I have here in my notes a whole series of examples of white-collar workers, if you will, or technical specialists, earning plaudits in the 50s and 60s, in some cases beyond. Some of you may not think of Olympic gymnasts or football stars as white-collar workers, but I'm basically referring to people who become well-known and much celebrated for certain professional accomplishments. And I'm suggesting that architects should be included among them, architects and town planners. Whether one should go so far as many convergence theorists did to interpret their increasing prominence as evidence of the growing power of the Soviet technostructure is another matter. Latitude, or as I've already suggested, professional autonomy seems to me more appropriate. Even if their work did have profound effects on the Soviet public, helping in toto to redefine the Soviet way of life, they could be interpreted as providing technical services, and it was on that basis that their expertise was permitted to rule. Convergence theorists' projections of the two vectors meeting at some point, the Soviet and the Western, capitalist, U.S. in particular, proved, of course, illusory. While the Soviet vector would continue along the modernist industrial path, Western capitalism was about to veer off in another direction, away from Fordism and toward more disorganized technologies, resulting in what David Harvey has famously called time-space compression. In the meantime, which is to say in the 1970s, the French Marxist social geographer Henri Lefebvre propounded another version of convergence, arguing in effect that in terms of conceptions of space, convergence had already occurred in the 1920s. Whether in the communist East or the capitalist West, the principles governing the production of space were the same. That is to say, and I quote, technicist, scientific, and intellectualized. Even though this approach, pioneered by the Bauhaus and Le Corbusier, was looked on at the time as both rational and revolutionary, it was tailor-made for the state, asserted Lefebvre, whether of the state capitalist or state socialist variety. Its characteristic feature, the fracturing of space via the cult of rectitude in the sense of right angles and straight lines, it represents, I think, a fair description of the new Tol'iatti. So if, as I've been arguing, Tol'iatti represented the apogee of such thinking, what are the larger implications? Although the historiography of this period of Soviet history isn't extensive, I've noticed a tendency to distinguish the 60s from subsequent decades. If the 60s represented promise, the 70s and 80s represented the 60s unfulfillment, the unfulfillment of that promise. Perhaps this interpretive framework originated in the 1980s with a justly celebrated book by Pyotr Weil and Alexander Gianis called The World of the Soviet Man. Or maybe it just seeped into scholars' consciousness by analogy with what the 60s meant in the West. The 60s are no more, long live the 60s. But there are two reasons why the application to the USSR of such a notion would be misleading. First, in political terms, the Soviet 60s came to an end well before the decade did. With Khrushchev's ouster in October 1964, the men of the 60s, the Shestidesiatniki, whom he had cultivated or at least tolerated, found themselves marginalized. Second, in other respects, the big changes came either earlier during the thaw of the 1950s and early 60s, or, as I have been arguing, continued to develop well after the end of the 60s. In drawing up their general plan for Tol'iatti in accordance with the approval by the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Rubenyenko and his colleagues had an extraordinary opportunity to apply the principles of architectural modernism. Unencumbered by private property or countervailing interests of any kind, they gave geometry full rein. They would do so at least once again, designing Naberezhnye Chelny, the truck town located in the Tatar Autonomous Republic that was built a few years after Tol'iatti. And you can see a sort of similar separation of the vast industrial areas, the proving grounds and what have you for the truck factory in this case, and the gridded micro-district based residential area. That's what it looks like from the air. Still, some of those who got in on the ground floor, as it were, later expressed regrets about how the project turned out. One of them was a former assistant director of VAZ, who assessed Tol'iatti's Avtograd in the following terms. This is from the perspective of the mid-90s. Unfortunately, far from everything planned for the 70s was realized, even 10 years later. Perhaps they weren't first-order objectives, but without them, the district lost something in its spiritual development. I don't want to console myself with the thought that such is the fate of all our new socialist cities. Anyway, that's a separate theme, large and instructive. Well, indeed, as of early 1976, 30,000 VAZ workers were waiting for apartments in Avtograd, and the district's kindergartens lacked spaces for some 20,000 of their children. 2 years later, in 1978, consumer services in Avtograd were reported to be meeting only 25 to 30% of demand. And over 1,000 families were occupying living space of less than 4 square meters per person. One might interpret these rather sorry statistics as confirmation of the lament I just quoted, as the failure of the 70s to fulfill the promise of the 60s. I reject this interpretation on the grounds that nobody could have believed the promise of everyone receiving an apartment and associated services in Avtograd in the first place, even if such a promise were made. Hyped as a model city and celebrated as the town with the youngest population in the country, the average age of a Tol'iatti resident in the mid-70s was something like 26. Avtograd was a Soviet company town par excellence. From the very beginning, VAZ assumed responsibility for all questions concerning the erection of housing and socio-cultural structures, and like every Soviet enterprise since the dawn of the so-called planned economy, consistently gave priority to material production even while it hired workers in excess of planned targets. Okay. It's not clear what Polikarpov, the assistant director whom I quoted earlier, meant by spiritual development. He probably didn't have in mind the absence of churches, for none was intended and none was built in Tol'iatti until 2003, when Avtovaz, the post-Soviet successor to Vaz, erected what Tol'iatti's entry on Wikipedia, see, I did my homework, refers to as, quote, one of the largest Orthodox cathedrals. That's not it. That's Tol'iatti in the 70s. I'm a little out of order here with the slide. There we are. One of the largest Orthodox cathedrals in the world. And next to that statement is a little thing which you may have noticed some Wikipedia entries contain that says citation needed. But Polikarpov may have meant that living in and living with those 9 and 16-story identical ferroconcrete structures that dominate the streetscapes and townscape of Avtograd and living without all the narrow lanes, small shops, single-story structures, cafes, used bookstores, hole-in-the-wall theaters, and all the activities accessible to casual passers-by that we have come to know and love in unplanned cities could be quite dispiriting. My argument is that the problem with Tol'iatti's Avtograd was not that the modernist dreams of Soviet architects and urban planners in the 1960s went unfulfilled in the 1970s, but rather that they were fulfilled. The problem was with those dreams and the unfettered, unbounded freedom that architects and town planners had to make in order to make their plans reality. It was not the failure to realize those plans, but their realization that produced what one Tol'iatti resident called a typical new town cultural environment. Blair Rubel, a name some of you will know, describes that environment as consisting of Kafkaesque anomie, little, if any, spontaneous street life, and sensory deprivation. One more quotation. A team of Moscow-based historians who produced a history of Vaz wrote that Avtograd accommodated 2 subcultures, that of the white-collar workers and their families who took advantage of the cultural and recreational facilities, some of which were cited in that quotation I read about prophylactoria, and what the authors describe as the other side of life in Tol'iatti, where the turbid waters of drunkenness, fights, knifings, and primitive leisure washed over the workers' quarters and dormitories. I'm not about to argue that this subculture was peculiar to the Soviet projects. One can find plenty of instances in the inner cities of the United States, for example. But one also can find the Bronx's Co-op City, the largest public housing project in the United States that happened to have been constructed at the same time as Avtograd. In Co-op City, racially diverse, predominantly working and lower middle class residents have lived in comparative safety and harmony, at least partly because Co-op City was planned, built, and administered under the aegis of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. Founded in the spirit of socialism and cooperative progressivism by trade unionists, in some cases, incidentally, had emigrated from Tsarist Russia as children, Co-op City differed from the start in the diversity of generations and types of employment of its residents, their sense of a shared ownership, and above all, their participation in the governance of where they lived. Tol'iatti, by contrast, repeated the Stalin-era formula of Soviet urbanization by which tens and hundreds of thousands of primarily rural dwellers were hastily recruited to build and then occupy so many, or as it was the case for the majority, so few square meters of living space. To conclude, earlier I mentioned a novel about the building of Tol'iatti, the dominant theme of which was the headlong growth combination of modern buildings and massive stands of primeval forests, representing a monument raised by our architects to the era of developed socialism. That's actually a quote that appeared in the novel. To conclude, I want to offer a quote from another novel, a novel called Aftergrad, written by a native son of Tol'iatti and published in 1994. Like much post-Soviet fiction that cast its glance backwards, the novel is pervaded by regret. In particular, regret over the destruction of the old Stavropol and the violation of the laws of Matushka Priroda, Mother Nature. I'll skip down to the final paragraph. As for the new Tol'iatti, and particularly the district of Aftergrad, from which the novel takes its title, one resident of the high-rises tells another, "Do you know what I think when I approach these colossal structures? I think that people lose any sense of themselves, become small insects, non-entities, actually nobody. Perhaps the builders specially built them with this subtext, so that everyone living here and everyone entering them is turned into a slave, deprived of any rights and vested with the obligation only to work." As a Soviet city invented in the 60s and associated with the dream of automobility, Tol'iatti bore the promise of a departure from older patterns of urban life, of a new beginning. At the same time, it also inspired, among those invested in the grandiose project of socialist construction, thoughts of recapturing the spirit that allegedly had animated previous projects, thereby knitting together in the form of a chain, as I mentioned earlier, one generation to another. But the trouble was that being the product of Soviet urban planning of the 1960s and 70s, which itself owed a great deal to Western avatars, Tol'iatti participated in what has been described as the escalating scale of continually expanded technical control over nature and a continually refined administration of human beings and their relations to each other by means of social organization. If that's a too dense quotation, I apologize. It's from Jürgen Habermas. Tol'iatti, could therefore not provide a better, more democratic version of urban living under socialism. Rather, it reproduced, on an even larger scale, some of the least appealing aspects of high-rise living in the Western world. Again, this from a few months ago in the city of Grodno. And again. And again. This is a photograph from July 31st of Tol'iatti. And the fires, which produced all kinds of apocalyptic visions. That's it. Thank you.